Her own parents had sold the inherited studio to save the dying startup of the golden son of the family. Not one phone call. Not one word of permission. Not a shred of guilt. The moment Ashley Carter dragged her suitcase home, what hit her was not the familiar door she had known for years, but the scream of drills, walls smashed open, paintings covered like trash, and workers tearing apart the place Grandpa Walter had left to her before he died. The room that held her youth, her dreams, and her dignity had been traded away for Ethan Carter's desperate business gamble. But that was not even the worst part. Buried in the sale documents was a signature bearing Ashley's name, even though she had never put pen to paper. And the instant she looked at her parents, she understood one chilling truth. They had not only taken her studio, they had already prepared to erase her from every ownership right she had. Ashley stood frozen in the middle of the white dust swirling around her, feeling as if every hammer strike was not landing on the walls, but straight into her chest. She rushed forward, yanked the tarp off her old easel, but all her hands found was chipped paint and broken wood. One of the workers turned to her and asked who she was, then coldly told her the project had been legally sold, and they were only doing what the contract required. Legally? Ashley laughed, but it came out as a short, terrifying sound. This was the place where Grandpa Walter had held her hand while she sketched her very first drawing. The place where she had stayed awake through endless nights to earn her first exhibition, the one thing in that house that had ever truly belonged to her. And yet now, her parents stood in the doorway as calmly as if they had simply moved out a few old boxes. Then her mother said the one sentence that made Ashley feel her blood turn to ice. "Don't be dramatic. We only used what this family had to save Ethan's future." Her father stepped forward, his voice hard and cold, as if he were reading a decision that had been made long ago. "Ethan was only going through a temporary setback," he said. "His startup was on the edge of landing a major investor, and the family could not just stand there and watch his future collapse over one studio. One studio." Ashley heard every word and felt her throat tighten. To them, all the years she had lived, painted, and worked herself to exhaustion inside that room weighed less than a few numbers in her brother's business plan. Ethan stood behind their parents, unable to look her in the eye, yet still bold enough to say that if the deal went through, he would get her a better place later. The words hit Ashley like a slap across the face, because in that moment, she finally understood the deepest pain of all. They had never seen her dream as a real life worth protecting. In this family, she was always the one expected to give things up. Ethan was the only investment they had ever believed was truly worth saving. But before Ashley could even swallow that shock, another detail even more horrifying slammed into her. On a folding table beside the construction paperwork, she saw the sales contract, fully signed and complete. Her name sat there at the bottom of the page, right under the line consenting to transfer the studio rights. Ashley snatched the document up, stared at the familiar yet wrong-looking signature, and felt a wave of cold race through her whole body. It was her name, but it was not her hand. That meant her parents had not only secretly sold the studio, they had already prepared an escape route, a way to make everything look legal if she ever fought back. Ashley lifted her head and looked directly at the people who had raised her, and for the first time in her life she saw one brutal truth with perfect clarity. They had planned to betray her long before she ever walked through that door. Ashley did not cry. Somehow, that made the air around them feel even heavier. She only tightened her grip on the forged contract until the paper crumpled in her hand, never taking her eyes off her parents. Her mother changed her tone then, softening into the familiar voice she always used whenever she wanted Ashley to surrender. She said things had not gone too far yet, that if Ashley would just be reasonable, the whole family could still sit down and work it out together. But Ashley could hear what was hidden beneath every word. They were not sorry for what they had done. They were only afraid she would make it bigger. Ethan stepped forward then and said the company only needed to survive this phase, that once it broke through, everything the family had done today would simply be an investment in the future. Ashley looked at her brother, then at the studio being torn apart behind him, and for the first time she understood something with complete clarity. In their eyes, she had never truly been a daughter or a sister. She had only ever been the backup asset. That night, Ashley did not go back to her parents' house. She took the contract, a few photos of the construction site, and sat alone in her car in the parking lot, staring at her own trembling hands. It was in that moment that one name rose suddenly into her mind. Megan Brooks, Grandpa Walter's old friend, now a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. Ashley called her almost in desperation, her voice raw from holding back too much for too long. Megan did not waste words. She only told Ashley to photograph every document, record as much of the site as possible, and come to her office first thing the next morning. Megan's calm steadiness made Ashley feel, for the first time that day, like she had been pulled back above water. At least in the middle of this chaos, there was still one person who did not treat her pain like something small. And when Ashley put the phone down, she told herself for the first time that this would not end as just another family argument. It was going to become a real war. The next morning, Megan Brooks sat across from Ashley in her office, flipping through the documents with a concentration so sharp it felt almost chilling. Unlike Ashley's parents, Megan did not say things like "calm down" or "don't think so negatively." She asked only 3 questions: how the inheritance had been written, where the original papers were, and who stood to gain the most if the studio had been sold in a rush. Within minutes, her expression changed. She looked up, pressed a finger to one clause, and spoke slowly, as if she wanted Ashley to understand every consequence of what she was about to hear. The building itself and the creative space inside it were not entirely tied under one single ownership right. The legal shell that Ashley's parents had sold might have been theirs, but the artistic renovations, the interior design structure, and the exclusive usage rights Grandpa Walter had transferred were listed separately under Ashley's name. In other words, the deal was not clean. They had sold something they did not have full legal authority to sell. Ashley sat there in stunned silence after Megan finished explaining. Until that moment, she had only thought of herself as the victim of a family that favored one child over another. But now the truth was even darker. This could be an intentional fraud. Megan pulled another folder from her drawer and compared the signature on the contract with Ashley's real signature from old academic records and exhibition paperwork. Even to the naked eye, the differences were obvious. The forged signature looked forced, as if someone had tried to imitate her handwriting without understanding the rhythm of her hand. And that was not all. Megan found a separate letter in the supporting documents sent to the buyer, describing Ashley as emotionally unstable, often out of the country, and incapable of managing her own property. Ashley read it and felt a freezing numbness spread through her. They had not only taken her studio, they had built a distorted version of her, one convenient enough to justify stripping every bit of control out of her hands. What hurt Ashley most was not the forged signature, but the contents of that letter. In just a few paragraphs, her parents had turned her into an unreliable, overly emotional daughter who could not be trusted to make important decisions and needed her family to step in on her behalf. Every sentence cut into the years she had spent fighting to live independently, winning scholarships on her own, building her career on her own, and proving again and again that she was never as fragile as they wanted to believe. Megan folded the letter shut, her voice more serious than ever. She told Ashley this was no longer just a question of family morality. Once the buyer had relied on false documents and a forged signature to carry out the transaction, Ashley had every right to demand emergency court intervention. Ashley sat in silence for a long time. Then she lifted her head, and for the first time, the pain in her eyes was no longer just pain. It had hardened into something else. If her parents had chosen to turn her into an outsider inside her own inheritance, then from that moment on, she would stop behaving like the obedient daughter they had counted on. Megan moved so quickly that Ashley could barely catch her breath. In less than a single afternoon, she drafted an emergency petition demanding an immediate halt to the construction, a freeze on the transfer related to the studio, and an investigation into the signs of forgery in the paperwork. Ashley signed each set of papers with trembling hands, but this time it was not fear making her shake. It was the feeling of someone who had finally stopped standing still while being crushed. Megan also instructed her to return to the construction site once more and film every ongoing change, because every wall torn down, every item removed, could become evidence of damage to disputed property. When they arrived, the sound of cutting and drilling still screamed through the building. Ashley stood before the door that had once been hers and watched flakes of paint fall from the walls, her heart tightening so hard it almost hurt to breathe. But unlike the day before, she did not rush inside helplessly. She stood straight, raised her phone, and began recording everything as if she were gathering back, piece by piece, the fragments of dignity they had trampled under their feet. The news that Ashley had filed in court reached the family faster than she expected. That evening, Her parents came to the hotel where she was staying, not to apologize, but to pressure her into taking everything back before the situation spread any further. Her mother spoke first, with the same tone of absolute righteousness Ashley had known all her life. She said Ashley was turning a private family matter into a public humiliation, that bringing lawyers and courts into it would only disgrace them all. Her father was even harsher. He said Ethan was standing at the most important investment round of his life, and if Ashley frightened off the partners, she would be the one directly killing her brother's future. Ethan sat beside them, pale-faced, but without a single word of protest. Ashley listened to every word, and then suddenly realized that not one of the three had asked whether she was hurting, what she had lost, or what that studio had meant to her. In that cramped hotel room, the final truth became impossible to ignore. They had not come because of love. They had come because their interests were slipping out of reach. Ashley stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the blurred city lights behind the glass. For the first time in years, she no longer felt the need to explain herself in a way they could understand. She turned back and said, very slowly, that if they truly believed they had done nothing wrong, then they should let the court decide. That one sentence froze the whole room. Her mother burst into tears immediately, calling Ashley ungrateful, saying the family had raised her, given her everything, and now she was willing to destroy her own brother over a single room. But Ashley no longer let those words drag her backward. She looked directly at her mother and said the issue was not one room. The issue was that they had forged her signature, lied about her, and sold something they had no right to sell. Ethan finally spoke then, but instead of apologizing, he only asked whether she understood how many people were depending on the startup. Ashley let out a bitter laugh. Even now, he still believed everything could be reduced to numbers, losses, and capital. The day Megan chose to present the legal documents at the construction site felt like an explosion in broad daylight. Ashley stood beside her in a simple black suit, her hair tied back, her face unnervingly calm. Around them, the construction crew was forced to stop mid-task as Megan walked straight in, handed the emergency order to the site manager, and demanded an immediate halt to all work. One by one, the machines went silent, leaving behind a stillness so tense it felt hard to breathe. Ashley's parents and Ethan were there too, clearly unprepared for the situation to go this far. Megan did not speak in circles. In front of everyone, she announced that the current transaction showed signs of invalidity because the sellers had transferred a space they did not fully own, while also submitting a signature that appeared to be forged. The words landed like a public slap across the face. Ashley stood at her side without saying a single word, yet somehow her silence became the loudest thing there. For the first time, people began to look at the Carter family differently. Ethan was the first one to break. He rushed toward Megan, saying this was just a paperwork misunderstanding, that everything had already been agreed on within the family, and that Ashley was deliberately sabotaging them. But the more he spoke, the more his voice fell apart, because even he knew he could not explain away the forged signature or the defamatory letter. Ashley's mother turned to her then, nearly shouting in front of everyone that if this deal died, Ethan would lose everything, the company would collapse, investors would walk away, and the whole family would suffer because of her. Ashley listened to every word the same way she had listened all her life. Every tragedy belonging to someone else would become her fault unless she agreed to sacrifice herself. Only this time, she did not lower her head. She looked her mother straight in the eye and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I'm not destroying Ethan's future. You built that future on something that was never yours." The sentence left the whole place stunned, because for the first time, Ashley was not merely resisting. She was tearing the family's mask off in public. After the confrontation at the site, the atmosphere inside the Carter family shattered completely. Ashley's phone filled with relentless calls, some from relatives, some from old acquaintances her parents had clearly fed their own version of the story to. Some told her to soften because Ethan was still her brother. Others insisted outsiders would never understand family matters and that it should all be handled privately behind closed doors. But every time Ashley heard that, she thought of the forged signature on the contract and the letter describing her as mentally unstable. Those things had not been created in a moment of anger. They had been calculated, planned. Megan reminded her of that too. Once people were willing to twist her very identity in order to take her property, this was no longer an ordinary family conflict. Ashley began blocking calls, keeping all communication through her lawyer, and preparing herself for the hearing ahead. She knew that from now on, the most painful part would not be losing her family. It would be accepting that maybe she had never truly had them in the first place. The hearing took place in a courtroom that was not especially large, yet the weight in the air felt crushing. Ashley sat beside Megan, her palms cold, her face calmer than she herself would have thought possible. Across from them, her parents and Ethan appeared exhausted, but still carried the air of people who believed that saying the word family often enough could blur the edges of wrongdoing. Megan began with a sequence of documents laid out with devastating precision: proof of split ownership rights, photos of the studio being demolished, comparisons between Ashley's real signature and the one on the contract, and the defamatory letter sent to the buyer. Each piece of evidence peeled away another layer of the story the Carter family had tried to build. Then the judge asked why the studio had needed to be sold so quickly. In that moment, every eye in the room turned toward Ethan, and for the first time, the ambition his family had protected and glorified stood naked in full view as the real force behind the betrayal. The decisive moment came faster than Ashley had expected. After reviewing the initial evidence, the judge ruled in favor of the emergency request. All construction activity had to stop until the ownership dispute was resolved, and the forged paperwork would be referred for separate review. The whole courtroom fell silent for a few brief seconds, but to Ashley, it felt like the first full breath she had taken in days. Ethan shot to his feet and tried to object, saying the stop order would cost him his investors and kill the company. But no one looked at him as a promising young founder being unfairly blocked anymore. In that courtroom, he looked like what he was, a man benefiting from a deal clouded by fraud. Ashley's father sank down in his chair, his face seeming to age years within minutes, and Ashley did not feel triumphant, not in the cinematic way people imagine victory. She only felt the bitter truth of it all. In the end, justice had done the one thing her family never had. It had stood beside her, just once. In the weeks that followed, everything began to fall like dominoes. Once investors heard about the legal dispute, they demanded a full review of all documents tied to Ethan, and that alone stripped away much of the polished shine his company had been wrapped in. The buyer of the studio pushed back too, realizing they might have been dragged into an invalid transaction. Meanwhile, Megan kept pressing the case, forcing the Carter family to acknowledge that the artistic space and the core renovations could not be transferred without Ashley's direct consent. Piece by piece, what had been sold as the solution for Ethan's future revealed itself for what it truly was: a gamble built on someone else's inheritance. Ashley still hurt when she thought about everything she had lost, but the shape of that pain had begun to change. It was no longer just the feeling of abandonment. It was the clarity of someone finally seeing the structure of unfairness that had been pressing down on her for years inside her own family. The day Ashley returned to the studio, the door was still stained with construction dust, the walls still half broken, and the smell of old wood and fresh plaster still hung in the air. The place was no longer whole, but at least it had not been stolen away from her completely. She moved slowly through every corner, touched the old easel with its chipped edge, and looked at the cracks in the wall while thinking of Grandpa Walter, the only person who had ever made her believe that her talent did not need permission to exist. She set her bag down, took out a stick of charcoal, and stood for a long time in front of a rough, unfinished section of wall. The first line she drew was not beautiful. It was not perfect, but it trembled with life. It was not just a mark. It was the moment Ashley stopped trying to be the daughter who was easy to sacrifice in exchange for love, and began living as someone who understood her own worth. The studio may have been broken apart, but this time, the person rising from the wreckage would be her. Ashley stood in the studio that had once been smashed apart, watching the late afternoon light slowly spill through the old window, and for the first time, she felt her heart grow still. She understood that this place would never return to exactly what it had been before, just as her family would never again be what she had spent so many years trying to believe in. But perhaps the most expensive lesson had never really been about the studio, or the lawsuit, or even the legal victory. It was this: she had finally looked straight at the truth she had spent years avoiding. Being family did not mean knowing how to love someone the right way, and sacrificing everything of yourself did not guarantee that you would be cherished. Ashley rested her hand against the half-finished wall, gave a faint, sorrowful smile, and whispered to herself, "The most expensive lesson I ever paid for was spending my whole youth begging for love from people who only saw me as the backup plan." But the most valuable thing I've learned is this: from today on, I won't beg anymore. I will stand on my own side.